Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today I'm going to be talking about 6 books that I don't think people talk about really anymore, and I got this idea from another bibliophile Reads, who has a wonderful channel, and he recently did 6 books that he doesn't really think people read anymore, and opened it up for other people to give it a try as well. If I really think about it, what this kind of became for me is 6 books that I absolutely love, that I feel like I don't find that they're spoken about as much as I would expect them to be, for as much as I loved them, if that makes sense. So these are 6 books that I feel, just in my personal opinion, are kind of underrated, and they should be read a lot more often. So, all right, let's get into it. Again, thanks to another bibliophile Reads. I'll have a link to his channel down in the description of the video, and you should absolutely go check it out. Wonderful, wonderful content creator. The first author I'm going to talk about is actually the one that I owe most of the success of my channel to. I did a video about one of his early novels that really blew up for me, and that is Roger Zelazny. But I had a really hard time deciding which Roger Zelazny to talk about, and I ended up deciding that for me, if the one that I would recommend, that I would know that most people would be hooked on right away, is For a Breath I Tarry, which is a novelette or a novella from early in his career. Yeah, Roger Zelazny is interesting because I know a lot of you right now are thinking, wait a minute, people talk about Roger Zelazny all the time. And that is absolutely true. People are continuously talking about Roger Zelazny, but I feel like they speak specifically about Amber, of course, which makes sense. It is his most popular work, the Amber Chronicles. And if they don't talk about the Amber Chronicles, then they might go to some of his later fantasy or slightly earlier fantasy, Jack of Shadows, that kind of stuff. But when they go earlier into his career, you'll see people talk about This Immortal. Of course, it tied with Dune for the Hugo. And you'll hear people talking about specifically Lord of Light. A lot of people really love Lord of Light, but there's an early part to his career when he was very new wave science fiction. And you could say, well, some of those that I just mentioned are new wave science fiction, and that's true, but not as new wave as his really early stuff. So, For a Breath I Tarry, a novelette or novella. It's in the best of Roger Zelazny, but it was published earlier than that. I think it goes all the way back to 1966. But yeah, it's been published in a lot of anthologies, a lot of collections, Roger Zelazny collections. The one I read it in was this new SF Masterworks, The Best of Roger Zelazny. And I don't want to give away too much of this, but it's about a satellite that is trying to figure out what it meant to be human after the humans have wiped themselves out. And I'm going to leave it at that. But I guarantee you, and this is probably the best way I can recommend this, if you are kind of in a rut with reading sci-fi, nothing's really excited you for a while, I guarantee you read this one, and that feeling that most sci-fi writers, I think, chase, of having your mind blown with the incredible, thought-provoking creativity of the science that is expressed through these stories, will... I've lost track of my sentence. You'll feel that feeling again with this one, I guarantee you. It's really, really incredible. One of my favorite sci-fi reads of all time. I had a hard time if I was going to put The Dream Master there. I just will say I love The Dream Master as well. It's the first Zelazny I ever read. It apparently was a huge influence on Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World on the actual Hard-Boiled Wonderland side of it, as he stated himself. So, which is why I first read it. So, yeah, Roger Zelazny. Go check out For a Breath I Tarry. You will not regret it. It's absolutely incredible. I'm kind of doing this by genre, I think. So now let's move on to fantasy. There is a fantasy book that I would, well, collection of books, of course, it's fantasy, that I would love to see made into a TV show, that I constantly seek out people that love fantasy to be able to talk about this specific series, and very few people that I come across have actually read it, and that is Mary Stewart's Merlin trilogy, which eventually ended up being a tetralogy. There was a fourth book added. This is the story of King Arthur told from the perspective of Merlin, but it goes even a step further in that it starts with Merlin's childhood and follows Merlin all throughout his life. So when all the really incredible, crazy King Arthur stuff is going on, we're actually following Merlin while he's out doing wizard stuff. And the wizard stuff is incredible. Mary Shelley really studied this concept. She goes back to the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth, I hope I said that right, and uses the actual legends of King Arthur to flesh out this incredible telling of Merlin. Probably the coolest wizard in fantasy writing, in my opinion. Not because of how important he is, of course, to science or to fantasy and history and myth, but because of how well she wrote this character. I cannot believe more people don't talk about this. This is another one that I can guarantee you, if you sit down and start reading it, within 20 to 50 pages, you're going to be just ripping through it. It's really incredible. It's so hard to get up the gumption to go read something that somebody has recommended you. I know that. I have that same problem as well. But sometimes the recommendations are spot on. I've read so many recommendations from other booktubers and from some of my readers that have been absolutely incredible. But I understand the feeling of kind of trepidation at starting them. But if you're looking for something to read in fantasy, and you would like, again, just like in the science fiction, I said, that feeling of awe and inspiration by the wonderful world that is created, you will love Mary Stewart's Arthurian trilogy. Moving on to horror, I know that there's a lot of expert horror readers that watch the channel, and I have really been diving into the weird tale recently and really enjoying it. But one of the things that I read in the 80s, in between Stephen King books, of course, when I really loved horror, was John Saul. And the book that I'm going to recommend by John Saul today is Suffer the Children, which is his first novel. Now, Stephen King and John Saul got into it at one point. Stephen King calling John Saul airport literature. They fought. They eventually made up, I think, and yeah, I think Stephen King gave him advice on his, I think it's, what is it called? The Blackstone Chronicles, which is another, that was the book I had a hard time deciding upon, this one or the Blackstone Chronicles, as to which to suggest. This is definitely not a Stephen King novel, right? This is its own thing, but it's spooky. It's got creepy kids doing crazy stuff. It's pretty hard-hitting, really truly a haunting tale that is really, really fun to read. I think you'll get hooked, and I think it will scare you. It's interesting because I talked about the awe of science fiction, the kind of imaginative worlds of fantasy. With horror, it's being scared, and I know the older I get, the harder and harder it is for a book to really scare me. So that's a really high bar to try to hit. But I think, you read this late at night when you're alone, I think this book would scare you. I really do. It's a really good time. And John Saul, I read, I think, almost all of his stuff up until the early 90s. And absolutely loved it. And then recently I came back and read, I hope I'm saying that right, the Blackstone Chronicles, I think that's what they're called. And I really loved those. So I think he was a really fun writer. And I know that there's so many different writers. We could have talked about McCammon. We could have talked about Michael McDowell, whose Blackwater saga was absolutely incredible. But I think people are starting to talk about these people. Dan Simmons, I feel like these aren't books that people are forgetting about. I feel like this is a book that people are forgetting about, and I think if you started reading it today, you would be hooked pretty fast. The last couple of books aren't really, I guess maybe you could call them magical realism, but for me, I like it really weird. And the first one is Helen Oyeyemi. I absolutely love this writer, and I rarely see anybody talking about her, and I think she's absolutely incredible. This book is called Mr. Fox, and it's been over a decade since I've read it, but here's what I remember. This is a professor, a college professor who's also a writer, having a back and forth with his muse, and they're having like a war, an argument through storytelling. So it's this constantly shifting narrative that's all over the place. And for some odd reason, characters keep getting beheaded. I don't know if that's typical for the guy. And we slowly start to realize that maybe the muse is trying... No. I think the professor's trying to kill the muse in these stories. It is absolutely wild. It's experimental writing, but in my opinion, it's very fun to read. I've only recommended this to one person and they did not like it, but perhaps you will, depending on how weird you like it. This is incredible. She also did The Icarus Girl. I think this was her first, and this was spooky, kind of connected to mythology. I loved both of these, but I put this one here because it's the most memorable for me. So yeah, if you're looking for something weird to read, give Mr. Fox by Helen Oyeyemi a try. I think you'd really enjoy it. I did. Last but not least is a book I read in college. I think it was a Scottish literature class, and it is Lannarch by Alasdair Gray. Really, really incredible story. And one of the first mind benders. I think I read this after Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, but only by a couple of years. And I think this was written prior to Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. Let's see. Yeah, this was written in 1980. Well, it was published in 1981, I think, was the first publication of this. Half of this novel, I feel like, reminded me a bit of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. And the other half of this novel is a person that wakes up in this unexplainable world that is part post-apocalyptic, part fantasy. It's Alice in Wonderland meets The Stand. It's crazy. It's really, really wild. And the whole time you're reading this, you're trying to consolidate these two narratives. And you're like, is he in hell? This is what happens in hell? And I tell you, the end goes to a place, and there is a conversation that was one of the most enjoyable, strange twists that I've ever seen in a novel. You might have heard of this guy because he wrote the novel that the film Poor Things was based on. So that's kind of his recent claim to fame. The only time I had ever heard of him before that was when this was assigned to me in my Scottish literature class. Never had heard anybody talking about it before. And it is absolutely wild, strange read. So there you go. There's 6 books that people aren't really talking about that I think are absolutely incredible and should be talked about a lot more just because of how good they really are. Once again, thanks to Another Bibliophile Reads for this wonderful idea. Again, go check out his channel. Great stuff over there. All right, thank you so much for watching.